Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started now. Thank you very much for your patience. Hello, my name is Amrit Gill, and I am the Artistic Director and CEO of the 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art in Sydney, Australia. 4A is pleased to be hosting today's talk online, Dwelling on the Outside, Searching for Folk Wisdom to Connect to Earth, a conversation between Adam Porter and Nguyễn-Long. 4A has been a leader in contemporary Asian art in Australia since 1996. We have an established and highly respected reputation among artists and audiences and an expanding network of international peers. Our work is presented from our home, a gallery in Sydney's Haymarket, as well as nationally and internationally. I'm speaking today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where sovereignty was never ceded. At 4A, we are privileged to work on Gadigal land, and we acknowledge elders past and present and thank them for their custodianship. 60,000 years of unbroken culture, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Dwelling on the Outside is part 2 of a 4-part online series supported by the Australia Council for the Arts as part of their Curatorial Associates program. This series is a partnership between Factory Contemporary Arts Centre and 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art and is supported by Campbelltown Arts Centre. Today you will hear from Adam Porter, Head of Curatorial at Campbelltown Arts Centre and participant in the Australia Council's Curatorial Associates program, as well as Sydney-based artist Nguyễn-Long. Before I hand over to Adam and Mai, I will take you through the structure of today's talk and go through a little bit of housekeeping. Adam and Mai will be in conversation and share a presentation for approximately 40 minutes. This will be followed by a question and answer session. If you have a question you would like to ask, please use the Q&A function and you'll see a button on the bottom row of the Zoom screen. And you can type in your question there and we will pick it up during the question and answer session. If you are experiencing any technical issues or would like to send me a message directly, you can use the chat function, which is also on the bottom row. Thank you to Adam and Mai for their time today, and I'll now hand over to them.
Thanks, Amrit. Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. Mai and I would like to acknowledge that we are streaming from Dharawal land, where we are honoured to live and work. We pay our respects to Dharawal people who are the traditional custodians of the land, whose deepening connection to culture and customs have cared for this country for over 60,000 years. We acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging for their immense spiritual connection to land and place which was never ceded. Dharawal land has always been recognised as a meeting place for people from other lands. And in this spirit, we respectfully continue the tradition through the bringing together of our communities through arts and culture. We also pay our respects to custodians of all the lands of which we are streaming from today and extend our acknowledgements to all First Nations people joining us. As Amrit introduced, my name is Adam Porter and I'm joined here today with artist Nguyễn-Long for a discussion and presentation titled Dwelling on the Outside, Searching for Folk Wisdom to Connect to Earth. Before we begin, I would like to provide some context for the discussion. And for those who have just logged in, again, my name is Adam Porter and I am an Australian curator of diverse Asian heritage, living and working in Southwest Sydney. My curatorial examinations have always centered around these semiotics and aesthetics of ruins, destruction and degradation as conveyance for and a reconstruction of cultural memory. I've worked in the arts for over a decade and was previously curator and head of curatorial at Casula Powerhouse Art Centre, and currently I am the head of curatorial at Campbelltown Art Centre. I'm also the inaugural recipient of the Curatorial Associates program, that again, a collaboration between the Australia Council for the Arts, the Factory Arts Centre and 4A Centre of Contemporary Asian Art, supported by Campbelltown Art Centre. So a big thanks to all of you for facilitating this opportunity. This Curatorial Associates program intended to provide Australian and Asian curators a unique opportunity to build Asia consciousness and capability, foster relationships with international artists, and develop an understanding of alternative curatorial contexts and work toward a major project, realigning the cosmos. Unfortunately, I was unable to get to Vietnam last year and much of the program was held online. My personal connection or knowledge of Vietnam up until this point was rather limited to my family's history of migrating to Australia. My grandfather was a fighter pilot in the US Air Force in World War II and was stationed in Darwin. He was shot down twice and survived, but from there on in, he would suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. His trauma was reignited at the announcement of the Vietnam War. His 3 teenage sons, the youngest, my father, would all be eligible for conscription. Hastily, my grandparents uprooted their lives in the US and moved to Australia in the 1970s, as far away as they could possibly get. Fast forward to 2020, when my participation in this program began, Mai invited me to curate an upcoming solo exhibition. And serendipitously, this led to really healthy discussions about our respective practices, my learning from the Cosmos project, a better understanding of contemporary art in Vietnam and Australia, and a deeper analysis of our personal, cultural, or spiritual connections to Asia. Ironically, my inability to visit Vietnam for this program has spurred this discussion topic based upon a shared experience of disconnect that Mai and I have to Asia and our own culture. I came to know Mai through my research of the archives and collection of Kusula Powerhouse Art Centre when I worked there. In 2011, we both participated in Edge of Elsewhere, the Emerging Critics Workshop and Curatorial with FX Harsono, hosted by 4A Centre of Contemporary Asian Art. So as noted, today, our discussion will touch on our shared experiences of otherness and how research and respect for traditional expressive forms of tangible and intangible cultural practice, or folkloric practices, can offer some kind of instructive wisdom. Believing that knowledge learned from these sometimes difficult to access or threatened practices can recalibrate our understandings of contemporary art. This dialogue emphasizes where translation and recontextualisation occurs, of how such knowledge can enrich our appreciation for our environment. Reflecting on my participation in realigning the cosmos and being situated in Australia, where Indigenous culture is also fraught by colonisation. Sorry, there's a train going past in the background, which is quite noisy, so I apologise if there's ambient noise. So starting again, reflecting on my participation in realigning the cosmos and being situated in Australia where Indigenous culture is fraught by colonisation, this discussion will attempt to respect culture and traditions whilst engaging with concepts of Earth, which was this year's chosen element of study in the Realigning the Cosmos project. Realigning the Cosmos seeks to examine the role, presence, and meaning of the 5 elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water in contemporary life, examining how they are used in human superstition or spirituality, reflecting on their consumption or neglect that are, in turn, of impact on the human and non-human world. So Mai and I have prepared a PowerPoint to talk to, and we will answer questions towards the end. But now I'd like to introduce you to Mai and to begin our discussion. Thanks, Mai.
Thank you, Adam, for inviting me to talk today, and for those who've tuned in from afar. I'd like to congratulate the factory for embarking on this ambitious program. It's complex and we found it really thought-provoking. So, yeah.
Oh, well, we'll get started. We're just about to share our screen, so just bear with us for a moment.
I see this conversation with you as an opportunity to throw up some aspects of the ideas that have influenced my clay sculptures relating to the idea of the earth element from an outside angle, or as outsiders of our own cultural belonging. It seems to be about building a meaningful relationship with the very physicality of the earth and questioning pre-existing value systems, how they benefit or detract from a greater whole. To be honest, thinking about Earth directly within the 5 elements context felt quite suffocating for me, so I had to drag it out and recontextualize it on a broader spectrum or timeline to start this conversation. In my own practice, I primarily respond to Earth through what I have learned through my encounters with village arts in Vietnam. Born 1970 makes me an Earth dog. My projects have long embraced dogs through my mongrel metaphors. However, although I identify as Ging, I was not raised with an awareness of elements or any Vietnamese culture at all. I was born when the White Australia policy was being dismantled and assimilation was still the norm here. Therefore, I respond to the concept of 5 elements with a more generic idea of balance. I grew up in big cement cities, somewhat alienated from the idea of Earth. My experiences visiting Bing in 1994 and more recently the Eco Art Muang Studio workshop conducted by Nguyễn-Long in Hòa Bình 2015 has helped me feel more aware of human connectivity to Earth. My comprehension of the complex and layered philosophical systems infused throughout Vietnamese history is something I'm only beginning to start to get my head around. My entry point has been a very visceral one through folkloric practices with Ding wood carvings as a point of departure.
So you would reference folkloric practices to inform your own contemporary arts practice?
Yes, my new work, Vijit Warana, the Vomit Girl Project, is inspired by the idea of folkloric practices as a totality of complex and multi-layered cultural phenomenon or tradition-based expressions that are continuously evolving. I try to understand Ding wood carvings in this context. I'm also interested in Thu Phap, an ancient indigenous religion of Vietnam involving worship of goddesses representing elements of nature distinctly linked to the environment. This includes goddess of clouds, rain, thunder, and lightning. In Vietnam, Buddhism was initially introduced from India, and later Confucianism and Taoism arrived from China. Taoism found a special compatibility with local animist beliefs. The Vomit Girl project is comprised of naked clay sculptures inspired by relinking to the earthiness of 16th to 18th century Ding, located in the river plains of northern Vietnam. They are rich with wood carvings. I reconnected with these Ding after a character named Vomit Girl kept appearing in my drawings. If clay is earth and clay absorbs water, my Vomit Girl iterations explore an idea of fluidity and dialogue with the spaces between different value systems and traverse border spaces through the materiality of clay.
Yeah, I see your practice as a kind of ongoing negotiation of the spaces in between absolutes or neatly defined boundaries of identity. This is what has drawn me to your practice, and I too feel that I operate from a space of otherness. Born in Australia to parents who migrated to Australia, there was always this pressure of assimilation imparted on me in order to survive and succeed. Growing up, I was always reminded of being a little different. My complexion was a bit dark, I had slanted eyes, and I had a funny middle name. And I actually refused using my middle name as a child, but now I totally embrace my differences. However, I now feel really disconnected to my cultural heritage because it wasn't nurtured in a deep and meaningful way. Likewise, you were born in Tasmania, in Australia, but spent much of your adolescence in the Philippines when your father found work there. You affectionately call yourself a third culture kid, and in essence, this makes me question our place on this earth and how we adopt values surrounding this element and the traditions or cultures attached to it. That said, I related your Vomit Girl character as an expression of rejecting culture. However, you have pointed out it is also about not knowing what voice to speak from or having no voice because you have considered so many competing historical perspectives that are all cancelling each other out, the impossibility of belonging. I noticed in your 2014 solo show, Neat Severances, that you had a group of Vomit Girl drawings exhibited amongst your spirit map drawings. For me, this conveys Vomit Girl as connected to spiritual illness. Can you maybe expand on that idea?
Yes, so rejecting suggests an inability to digest. Vomit Girl just appeared and I did not understand why, but I could not make her go away. I finally thought of this as a spiritual illness. I first used the name Vomit Girl in 2014 after I made a quick pen drawing of a girl raising her head to one side of a bed, involuntary expulsions falling from her mouth into a strategically placed bucket. Other vomiting figures quickly followed in my visual diary, often floating in space, innards spilling out of their stomachs, limbs cut off, eye sockets blacked out, some with multiple faces, their expulsions suggesting dog, fish, or nondescript ghost-like forms. On 14 November 2018, during my fieldwork in Vietnam, after yet another appearance of Vomit Girl in my visual diary, I wrote under the image, "She's here to stay, so I have to listen to what she has to tell me." At this point, I knew she had to play a central part in my new project. Her vomit signified desperation about what voice to speak from and how to bridge a dense chasm of multi-layered narratives and hauntings. I think it is about a perpetual state of be/longing, and building with clay is a counterbalance to being disconnected. It has been quite a ritualized and meditative process for me. As an earth dog, my interest in the creative spaces between folk and elite structures my interest is in the creative spaces between folk and elite structures as interstitial. This is what informed my mongrels and my interest in non-binary realms between victim-perpetrator. And in my clay sculptures, the dance between abstract and figurative forms, the messy boundaries of identity, belonging, possibilities for transformation, and how we are all implicated in cycles of contradiction.
Yeah, so even though you say your work is from this conflicted space, it also comes across as very playful. The sculptures seem mischievous. Even the more abstracted ones appear to be characters in some otherworldly story. The scale varies a lot too, from very small 1 centimeter sized Warana to, for example, a 90 centimeter tall Warana pod goat fairy, as if they are in a cosmos of their very own.
That's cool you see it that way. I've also had other comment from a few other people. They are surprised how joyful my new works are. This is strange for me, as it was not intentional, but it makes sense because a key feature of the Ding wood carvings of the 16th to 18th century period I've been drawn to is their robust playfulness. Playfulness and imagination are expressions of spiritual resilience and a defiance of restrictive hierarchies. I have come to understand the wood carvings as a form of carnivalesque transcendence, like festivals. This is a momentary relaxation from fixed border spaces. In Ding Tang, mocking the otherwise regal authority of a dragon, a fairy clutches her bare breasts as she rides it. In Ding Te Dang, which is this slide, is it this slide? Yeah, it's this slide. Ding Toha and Ding Hunglok fairies are placed alongside village girls, something previously unheard of as they belong to a higher sphere. Similarly, the abundance of playful puppy-like dragons, such as in Ding Ha Hiep, resists orthodox narratives. My new sculptures have been directly inspired by my 1994 encounters, a sense of earthing through the Ding. It was the Ding that instilled in me a sense an immense wonderment when up until then all I had been exposed to were images of destruction. However, I suppressed these encounters after returning to Australia. 2 decades later, after the continued appearance of Vomit Girl in 2014, I knew I had to reconnect with Vietnam. And as my project evolved, I knew I had to reference the Ding as a key in my strategy to reconnect with Vietnam.
I can definitely see these references in your current project, Vijit Warana, the Vomit Girl project. Can you maybe elaborate upon your current research and how your background and experiences have led you to this point?
Okay, yeah, my current PhD research project is with the University of Wollongong and explores an intersection between contemporary art and folkloric practices in Vietnam. The working title is Beyond Diasporic Trauma, Opening Up an Intersection Between Contemporary Art and Folkloric Practices in Vietnam. It is part of a Doctor of Creative Arts program, a unique degree for visual artists. Under the program, I produce a new body of work and a research paper which supports this work. I'd like to stress that my research project is actually still in progress and the artwork's not yet exhibited. Images you see are from a mock setup in a private room. Adam and I are sharing these images of my work with you today as we talk about some of the ideas I've considered as I've created the works. In my project, art production is not led by theory or a preconceived idea, but through the making of the art itself and searching for an understanding of open-ended ideas. In my case, I was looking for a way to open stories beyond binary narratives of diasporic trauma, which I argue has contributed to intergenerational trauma through acculturation, in other words, culturally transmitted. Like you, Adam, I speak from the perspective of an outsider in several senses. I was born in Australia, but grew up in Papua New Guinea and the Philippines. My father came to Australia when he was 17 and married my mother, a fourth-generation Anglo-Irish Australian. I was told I was Australian, but I felt I was disposable, never as good as being white. In other words, I had already absorbed a sense of colonial mentality or internalized racism. I wanted to study Vietnamese language but did not have access to any resources to learn it. I studied art history, including Asian art history at an Australian university, but there was a lack of information and focus on Vietnamese contemporary art, as if it did not exist or was not part of the art world. It was absent, or at best a smudge in cursory and often disparaging references. I found life in Australia so alienating that I left the country to live in Vietnam. It was from there that I entered Hanoi for the first time. Oh, I went to live in China, not Vietnam. It was from there that I entered Hanoi for the first time in 1992. Mind you, I had already visited Soc Trang in the deep south of Vietnam several times to visit my extended family. The first time was 1978. My determination to learn Vietnamese came to fruition in 1994, which proved a most incredible year of my life. I was warmly welcomed in Hanoi and finally learned to speak the language. I also studied Vietnamese art history. I was proud as punch to write a paper about Dinh wood carvings in Vietnamese language under the supervision of Professor Nguyễn Big, who worked at the Vietnam Fine Arts Museum at the time and had conducted important research in this area. I felt I had come home.
It's interesting because at the same time, the APT was just established in the early 90s and was a really pivotal point in Australia's diplomatic relationships with Asia. It was also a really significant chapter in the history of contemporary art in Australia. In 1996, you were involved as a research assistant for the Australian curator at Quag Goma, or the Queensland Art Gallery of Modern Art, who was appointed to select the Vietnamese artists, and you became the interpreter and guide for the artists when they arrived in Australia for the APT. This must have been hopeful, surely, but however, I note that you suppressed your Dinh encounters after returning to Australia. Can you maybe expand on that?
Yes, the APT was an incredible time. In general, yes, it was an incredible time for me, but somehow it got truncated. Not long after the APT, I attended a global cultural diversity conference in Sydney. Ironically, it was there that I found that my newly acquired language, the Hanoi accent I had worked so hard to get right, was met with outrage by a respected leader in the community. Feeling overwhelmed, my response was somewhat extreme. I altered my name to dilute its Vietnameseness and vowed to reprogram myself as an assimilated Australian and quite literally delete all my lived connections outside of Australia, including the languages I had learned. 10 years later, when I was invited by Casula Powerhouse Art Centre to participate in I Love Pho, a whimsical platform for exploring a serious topic of the diversity of Vietnamese identities in Australia, I felt a weight had lifted. I created 12 papier-mâché mongrel fur dogs. I suddenly leapt into a medium which I had encountered in the Philippines in a celebration of Southeast Asian folk crafts. Each mongrel dog had an individualized statement about how they preferred to eat their fur. Their painted skins were themed: boats, animals, heroes, vegetables, family, trauma, love, etc., with motifs of competing views and values juxtaposed. Unfortunately, this work was met with controversy and triggered me to censor the entire installation.
Yeah, so I know this work really well. It was a little bit before my time working at Casula Powerhouse, but I know it still exists in the Casula Powerhouse collection, and I have always admired it for its quirkiness and vibrancy of color. Why did you feel you had to censor this work and censor the entire work?
Well, I could say it was a zero-sum situation. However, instead of censoring, I wanted to cover the whole thing instead of censoring one mongrel. I was censored to pressure to actually destroy one, but I covered them all with a black sheet, explaining that to censor one would be to treat that mongrel differently to its fellow mongrels, and hence against the concept of my installation where the mongrels need to be seen in context as well as individually. Apart from a short trip back to Vietnam as a result of this incident, for a long time I remained in a pretty dark hole.
And when did you return to Vietnam?
Oh, that was 2009. And this generated my performance installation piece, The Burning of Godog.
And that was at Casula Powerhouse
at
as well.
Casula Powerhouse Art Centre.
And a separate exhibition?
Yeah, as part of Nambang, curated by Boychun Huyen Beatty. And then in 2014, I was commissioned by Wollongong Art Gallery for a solo show curated by Gina Fairley titled Biogmos. I made this word up from the phrase beyond the dog cosmos because I was going beneath the skin of the dog via a splayed papier-mâché carcass central to the exhibition. This going beneath the skin echoes my current use of naked clay, a kind of exploring abstract ideas behind the skins of artifacts. It was Biogmos that compelled me to return to Vietnam again because I realized the entire exhibition was driven by absence, including language I lost and the good memories of my 1994 Vietnam encounters that I had thrown away. I felt I had no other option. My new body of work has evolved out of that return. Vidget is my goddess of infected tongues for all those who have lost their mother tongue. And a concept of Vidget Warana informs the 120, well, her 120 iterations, some with up to 30 subparts that are all part of this Womit Go project. In the project, they're displayed on the ground, connected to the earth. Warana is coined from worm dragon snakes. This borrows from the worm-like dragons of the Buddhist monarchic rule of the Li dynasty, and the mother goddess snakes, mother goddess Liu Hang's mother goddess snakes, and the idea of village as a metaphoric portal to connect to the earth. I am absolutely Australian, but my Vietnamese heritage is important to me. I've been shaped by it, so I cannot ignore it. I guess the discombobulation, self-deprecation or mockery, and combining celebration with erasure in my artworks has reflected some of these personal experiences contextualized within historical traumas. I consider my somewhat extreme response to rejection by those whom I thought I belonged to or with is linked to my own internalized racism, a colonial mentality with a very long and dark shadow, but invisible. I think of this as the enemy within. Hence, my interest in reconnecting with Ding is as a decolonization strategy, albeit I stress this is an open-ended strategy, which I've come to think simultaneously celebrates and erases. If that doesn't sound too contradictory, this celebrate erase concept compares with the project we did at 4A together, where CORE, COR, which is the name of our exhibited project, was stood for celebrate, obliterate, recreate, and also my metamorphic mongrel workshops, where the generic calico bear is beheaded, then transformed into a unique mongrel dog. My new work is about adopting creative strategies of folkloric practices which suggest adaptive resilience, adapting, morphing, the fluidity of continuously forming and reforming to resist or evade domination. This is what my clay sculptured vomit girl iterations do. They are celebrations of marginality. In the Vietnam context, learning about Vietnamese culture and history is challenging due to language barriers. Many documents are still locked away in Vietnamese language. Publications are often in very limited runs. Equally challenging are the continued hauntings which do not support and even actively discourage meaningful connections with Vietnam. There is a lot at stake here because there is an art history in Vietnam. It is rich, complex, and layered, and village arts and imperial arts with folkloric practices filtered throughout interstitial spaces are all part of this history. There are many voices and diverse tangents. Tradition is never a static idea.
Tradition is never a static idea. I really like that. It can be evolving and subjective. But let's bring this conversation back to earth, so to speak. Tell me about your first encounters with the Ding and how you see this related to being connected to the earth. What is Ding and what is it about the Ding that connects your work to earth?
As the largest structure in the village, Ding architecture was designed to harmonize with nature. The location and orientation were chosen by a geomancer who worked with spirits of the land. Its horizontal layout is guided by balance and connectedness to the earth, honoring wet rice agriculture that links heaven with earth. The boat-like roof is 2/3 the height of the outermost support column, staying low to the ground and embedded in the landscape. Practical and multifunctional, it was centrally located and managed by elders. The Ding serves administrative and spiritual needs of the entire village, including managing disputes, fines, and festivals. It provides a place to worship tutelary spirits. These Ding guardians reflect Vietnam's layered cultural history, strong agrarian connections, and the ethnic composition of the population. The earliest known surviving Ding is Ding Lo Hang in Bắc Giang province, dated to 1576. 16th to 17th century Ding have the most vignettes from everyday life. Similar to Ding culture and wood carvings, clay has a history that combines the functional, practical with the spiritual ritual. I translate the earthiness and natural tones of the Ding wood carvings into naked clay. Artist Dang Thi Que sees mock marks such as the mock mark of Ding wood carvings as a humane aesthetic connecting humans with nature, signifying ephemeral and non-monumental inner beauty. These aesthetics contrast with overbearing forms such as fierce or shiny dragons. I borrow the term mock mark to describe an aesthetic of primordial persistence guided by practical principles of survival. Mock mark is generally taken to mean rustic, rough, uncouth, natural, simple. As mentioned in my naked clay sculptures, I borrow it as a celebration of marginality. Mock mark is a complex and historically resonant aesthetic. As my experience of it is tied to the Ding, I also link it with playfulness as resistance. Hence, in a recent article, Arts Hub interview with Gina Fairley, artist William Young when he described partying during the AIDS pandemic as a kind of expression of resistance within the LGBTQI community. This resonated with me. At the same time, I recognize the contradiction of hiding my references to the Ding by rebuilding my encounter through clay and changing the forms, sometimes completely abstracting them. I do not attempt to replicate existing cultural forms. These are gestures of transformation as a conversation with clay, mirroring the non-static nature of tradition. This may also allude to experiences of cultural censorship and suppression of histories in the Australian context, including subconscious self-censorships. The material nature of clay is a key player in this process because I allow it to guide my building process, not directing it with molds, but incrementally building it from bottom up using clay coils with my hands and working across 8 different clays, each with different textures and tones. I think of clay as my other, an entity with life and a voice of its own. Clay has clay, a historical legacy of its own, which according to Alderton and Muriel, has a long relationship with human history, arguably one of the richest histories of any medium on the planet. What results from my building process is a transformed relationship between myself and the Ding, one that is more connected to other histories, yet still a celebration of the Ding. This process of conversing with clay released Vomit Girl from her Vomit Girl form and allowed her to transform her shape to accommodate other histories and other hauntings. I'm fascinated by the ebb and flow of border spaces of identities and wrestles or dances between territorialization and deterritorialization, or process of forming and reforming, hence my multiple iterations. The potent cultural and historical context for Mokmak extend the storytelling capacity of the Ding wood carvings in a more expansive framework. I recontextualize Mokmak as a contemporary expression of spiritual resistance connected to the earth. Clay is easily accessible, a quality which the jackfruit wood in Vietnam used to carve the Ding wood carvings also shares. Both mediums are practical within their own context, like the essence of the Ding connected to the earth. My sculptures are earth itself. The lineage of concepts connects, this lineage of concepts connects with supernatural powers of earth and nature spirits and changing seasons that have informed Ding cultural expression. Rebuilding the wood carvings into naked clay suddenly opened my eyes to the rich and earthy clay traditions throughout Vietnam I had previously felt disconnected from or less able to relate to. For example, I now have a greater appreciation for hand-formed unglazed pottery that archaeologists have linked to the 3,000-year-old Sa Huyen culture. In this practice, firing is still done above ground using wood, rice straw, and rice husks, dependent on natural elements described as spiritual forces. I want to share with you the naked clay sculptures of British artist Anthony Gormley. This work, Field, 1989 to 2003. Of this, he comments that the earth holds the memory of our ancestors and also the promise of the unborn. I really love the work of ceramicist Lawson Oyakan. His naked clay sculptures draw from a Nigerian practice of creating a place to house disease-making spirits transformed from the human body. As such, naked clay aligns with my ideas of transformation, healing, and nurture, actually, the naked honesty of human bodies, spirituality, and bare subsistence connected to the earth. Essentially, I adapt Mokmak as aesthetic as storyteller, And this aligns with ideas that the universalization of aesthetics is inseparable from the colonial matrix of power.
I think it's obvious that you reflect upon folk wisdom in your work, and I can appreciate the materiality of your work in the context of other artists who are working with naked clay. But intriguingly, your practice references modern history or this accumulation of past traumas.
I built my clay sculptures along what I call the Ding Bombshell Bell axis, or the DBBA. After bombshells I saw repurposed as village bells in Ding courtyards in 1994 and again in 2015. This cylindrical shape guided the forms of all my Vomit Girl iterations. And I envisaged the building blocks that I use, clay coils as worm dragon snakes or warana, as mentioned earlier. Through warana and my multi-pronged relinking, the DBBA no longer contains one traumatic point of reference, but multiple traumas and multiple histories. Folk wisdom has a way of interfacing with multiple histories and memories, or transcending restrictive paradigms.
Yeah, I think we spoke about this at length about the following the previous online discussion. Lei Jiang seemed to suggest that folk beliefs would have informed community practices prior to the case study she was exploring, where esoteric values attached to precious stones have been outweighed by a greater focus on competitive prestige rather than maintaining some balance with a great cosmic whole. There appears to be an imbalance. So how have folkloric practices and folk wisdoms influenced your understanding of balance?
Yeah. Well, I think balance is everything, and everything is constantly in flux. When something is unseated, it requires counterbalance. For me, folkloric practices is a stand-in term for these ongoing process of renegotiation. It is the wisdom to know how to do that. Within any system of values, there will always be ways of thinking or doing that need to change in time to adapt to new circumstances. The issue is how to identify this and not just to throw everything out to become more so-called civilized or cosmopolitan. When values are broken down, there is a floating disconnectedness and excessive vulnerability. I consider that a bigger problem, at least in my own struggle, is to reconnect with positive aspects of my heritage, has been what I have termed colonial mentality or internalized racism, the enemy within. Inspired by Lei Zhang's mention of folk beliefs during last session's presentation, I went and I read an article called Beliefs of Life Cycle in the Cultural Life of Ethnic Minorities in Northwestern Vietnam in Current Context, dated 2019. Here authors Le Van Loy and Hoang Thi Lan present very detailed descriptions of rituals of childbirth, marriage, sickness, and funerals across 6 provinces where there are more than 30 different ethnic groups. It outlines how some customs have changed because of external pressures and influences, for example, accessibility of non-ethnic alcohol, and cites instances where carefully contextualized sleeping visits have evolved into harmful commercialized sleeping practices. These societal imbalances have sometimes triggered exaggerated counterbalances, which in turn contributes to further imbalance. In conclusion, Le Van Loy and Hoang Thi Lan suggest that, and I quote, "It is necessary to expand cultural exchanges, enrich the cultural values of ethnic groups, overcome the inferior attitude in the concept of ethnic minorities, therefore create favorable conditions for ethnic minorities to have a deep understanding of the history and culture of their ethnic groups, appreciate, preserve, and promote their good traditional values, in the lives of individuals, families, and society, end of quote. As a King Vietnamese, I think this equally applies to King history and culture. Prior to the 5 elements becoming part of the Vietnamese psyche, there were pre-existing value systems, i.e. the nature goddess belief systems and practices which express connectedness to Earth. A lot of knowledge has been lost through violence and the race to become more civilized. Contradictions are everywhere. Valuing one's own without devaluing another can be a tricky balance. Boundaries are important, but so is porousness. I continuously dialogue this conundrum through my clay forms as they morph in and out of different forms through numerous and changing iterations of Vomit Girl. Because I'm interested in how old nature spirits have morphed and grafted. In Vietnam, as new cultural layers and forms of governance were introduced throughout history, rather than being replaced, older nature spirits morphed and are grafted. For example, statuary in Dâu Đậu Tướng and Gian Pagoda in Bắc Ninh province appeared to be Buddhist iconography, but are in fact representations of the 4 Tứ Pháp goddesses. Patrick McAllister and Tikam Thu Lachman argue, quote, in ancient Vietnamese beliefs, male and female gods held equal status. But through Chinese influence, many of the female gods were transformed into males, end of quote. Do Mi Thien explains the legendary Zong is an example of the national defender motif being grafted onto an older nature fertility motif. If a UNESCO document states folklore is a universal heritage of humanity, then trying to understand the multiple layers and evolutions within this cultural knowledge must be an enriching endeavor.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, despite not having a chance to visit Vietnam and the factory team, I realized that the representation of communities and cultures in Vietnam is very diverse. It wasn't until I realized this that Vietnam, like Australia, through a history of occupation, makes an understanding of community and culture complex and murky. This is further complicated through the displacement of people from their home or their places of belonging, their roots. That can be at times of conflict or even now environmental disasters. So I find it interesting that in your case, that your father was born in both Dong Thap province in the deep south and your extended family lives in Soc Trang today. And how do you explain this in relation to your interest in Northern Ding and Mok Mak as a Northern aesthetic? How do you earth yourself in Soc Trang in Australia and in your practice?
Yes, as well as being from the southernmost state of Australia, my Vietnamese bloodlines also originate from the deep south of Vietnam. Originally from Dong Thap province, my grandparents relocated to Soc Trang in the 1970s. I felt a need to synthesize these experiences using Mok Mak and family history as an expansive relinking strategy beyond the Ding. My readings on Ding history led me to Mother Goddess Liu Hang, and then to my aunties in Soc Trang who worship at a Tien Ho Mother Goddess temple. Originally from China, through a complex process of acculturation in Vietnam, Tien Ho returned to its origins as a folk cult. At Tien Ho temples you can find Ông Tiêu. Ông Tiêu is an incarnation of Avalokitesvara with a long tongue to ward off evil spirits. After discovering Ông Tiêu through my mother's book, I immediately grafted his tongue's function onto Vomit Girl's vomit. From that point, instead of being a motif of illness, Vomit Girl became connected to other histories and associated with healing. When I began to make insertable clay tongues, well, I think of these as her lucky talismans. These insertables can be swapped and changed, promoting an idea of play, continuously evolving stories, and the messy edges of memory and identity. Inserting my clay parts into Vomit Girl's holes reminds me of the fine line between notions of violence and nurture. I enjoy the ambiguity. The insertable tongues evolved into different shapes, echoing motifs that have been absorbed into the clay bodies of Vomit Girl. Just a few of these various amalgamations of morphed motifs absorbed into Vomit Girl, my Vomit Girl iterations, with some as tongue vomits or vomit tongues, include Ushnisha-like form on the head, which is a Buddhist motif, 5 spires of Helocid, a seismic intrusion detector dropped from a helicopter, fleshy elongated earlobes of ding fairies, truncated wings, exoskeleton architectural supports within ding internal structures, lotus pods, Buddha's mother's gesture of covering one eye, a ceramic object which was misidentified as Chinese for 500 years, poo balls, 3 or more prongs indicative of Vietnam's diverse regional accents, chicken, fish, toads, goats, and a variety of other animals with folkloric associations. Ong Jill provided Vomit Girl with a cultural grounding for her vomit to also be a tongue, then progress to relinking with the ding and beyond. I have marked and scarred various sculptures with extracted teeth, my own and my father's, the quill of endangered porcupine in Vietnam, and broken chopsticks from mixed Asian eateries in Australia. My ladder-like markings echo the ceremonial Khmer terracotta vessel, ritually smashed by a monk at my grandmother's funeral in 2018, and the tiny ladder which was placed on her grave for her soul to climb out. My choice of orange for Vomit Girl as Vijit Warana CGO Vomit Girl is directly linked to Sokchang, a small selection of glazed objects mingled in with my naked clay provide rogue bursts of color. This smattering of brightly glazed objects has become a nod to my Sokchang heritage. At the same time, these are the color bursts of fresh fruit offerings across multiple regions and border spaces. For instance, Waranamite chicken hand is glazed citrus yellow, like the color of the popular finger citron, also referred to as Buddha's mother. Earthing myself in Australia has been a much longer journey. Like you, Adam, I now live south of Sydney on Aboriginal land, Dharawal country. The Dharawal people remain the traditional custodians of this land. Walking barefoot on this land has opened my eyes to the natural tones of my sculptures. I no longer see my naked ceramic works without glaze, but complete and resplendent with color. Again, I am drawn to Australian artist of Chinese descent, William Young's connection to Taoist principles and his spiritual journey to find belonging in Australia through his relationship to nature. For example, on a self-portrait with stars, he writes, I often have a spiritual experience at Frogs Hollow, which is a suburb in Brisbane. I surrender to nature. I have profound thoughts. I become part of a bigger thing, the land, the trees, the weeds, all living creatures, the sky, the stars, universe. I lose that petty creature, myself. My divinity is a oneness with nature.
Such a great photo.
Taking clay from my local beach and walk firing it to explode, then adding these to my collection of sculptures was a ritual metaphorical gesture to link my ding experiences with the place where I now reside.
Thank you, Mai. I think we can end there. We have come full circle, traversing the earth from Australia to Vietnam and back again. I hope we'll also have an opportunity to visit Vietnam in the near future and work with other artists exploring the increasingly and more complex worlds we find ourselves in today. You've really opened up my eyes to some aspects of the country, the culture, and the contemporary arts that I was not previously aware of. So thank you, and I look forward to learning more.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Maybe we'll head over to some questions.
Thank you, Mai and Adam. I'm going to use the Q&A function to triage the questions. So if you do have any, please click on the Q&A button on the bottom row and type in your question. Our first one is from Zoe Butt from the factory. Zoe says, thank you, Mai and Adam, for this talk. I have two questions for Mai. You refer to two concepts that I'd love to hear explained more. You refer to a lot of din, which essentially is a communal house for village gatherings and spiritual ritual. This culture, most dominant in North Vietnam, indeed marginalizing many other ethnic practices. How does the practice of communing have presence in your work? You have shared a lot of imagery and objects, but what role do people conversing play in your work? I'll come to the next one in a minute. I'll let you take that one first.
Okay, first of all, if Zoe could explain what she means by communing more to me, please, in this context.
We're not, we don't have people on video for questions, so we're going to have
How do you
to...
understand communing, Adam?
Communing or coming together, I guess. Let me just read that question again.
Yeah, first I should probably answer though to the idea about majority minority and marginalization, because I think that's a key issue here. And I'm aware and accept the perspective that you're expressing here. But where all I can say is that where I'm coming from is that in the context of an Australian Vietnamese, when you move from one border to another, there can be different equations between what's majority and what's minority, and I'm simply coming at it from my personal perspective. But secondly, what I've tried to do is, because that was the moment, actually there was a bit that cut out there when the sound cut, but what I was trying to explain was that prior to my encounter with the Ding in northern Vietnam, I actually had no sort of idea about being able to imagine what it was like to be Vietnamese, to have a Vietnamese heritage beyond the war imagery that I had grown up with and the Vietnam War movies, etc. So what happened with me was that it kind of opened my mind to new imaginings about possibilities of connected with Vietnamese identities. I did suppress that when I came to Australia for the very reason that you've raised in this query. And that was 20 years ago. So what I've realized I have to accept what that is and how this touched me. But through that, I then relinked through the morphing forms of my sculptures through my family history, for example, in Sokchang, and that way, and bringing in the morphing and the spaces between different cultures where they interact with each other beyond ideologies. So that's partly my answer. The other answer is, when I have gone through this reconnecting process, I've interviewed people and spoken to artists and did a lot of site visits. But of course, it's an ever ongoing journey. And so basically, I try to focus on the materiality of clay to bring in these other histories.
I think that going back to this question about the Ding being a communal house, I guess there's this sense of, I think how I've always read Mai's practice is the adornment within this Ding. Yes, they are used, they have a purpose, they have a function. As clay does, if it's you know, it's assumed that clay would have a function if it's designed as a vessel or it looks like a vessel, whereas Mai's doesn't. It's taking that, it's taking that function and turning it into, and that adornment, and turning it into her way of understanding part of her culture via the adornment of the ding. So I think that it's not really about communing with other people necessarily, but it does link us back into the community of you know, our community that we're disconnected with.
Yeah, it's an avenue. It's like a portal to reconnect. Simply in this project that has found me the medium of clay for me, because how could I then? So in that way, if you look at my sculptures, you wouldn't even. They're connected to something else when you look at them, but that's where they started.
Yeah. And I think
that's the whole point, to connect, but then to go borderless somehow, because you can't throw away your heritage, because I can't apologize for having had that as one of my first encounters with my cultural heritage. So how do I then let that sit within everything else, and all these other stories? And yeah, it's
and it's also how I came to the project. You know, I being remote, I was feeling like I was losing that sense of community, and in the work that I do within a gallery that is very much connected to its community and representing ideas that you know, come from that community, but reflect universal values. I think I you know, I didn't necessarily go out searching for it, but I think serendipitously, when Maya and I were talking about her solo exhibition, you know, I made a lot of the ideas from the Cosmos project started to make sense. And that's how I came, you know, we came to this this presentation today, and the topics and things that we'd been discussing in reflection.
And the other issue about the ding too is then I tried to focus on what was it about that encounter, and I haven't sought to be some kind of expert in the ding, far from that, and I'm only trying to learn about it now and relearn Vietnamese and all of these things. But and I'll keep trying to do that. But what I wanted to focus on is how I understood Mok Mak, which was a word I became very fascinated by, that was linked to the ding encounter, and to think of it as an aesthetic that links humans with the environment, I think is the to me the underlying driver here. So
and that maybe leads on to that second question.
The mother
Amrit,
goddess.
did you want to repeat?
The reason why I mentioned mother goddess was because when I was researching about the Mak dynasty, there was one historian who actually spoke about Liu Hang as being born of that same dynasty. And then I was fascinated how she could begin as a grassroots counterculture to be now quite openly celebrated and so popular today. So from that, then I wanted to know what my aunties did in Sopchang. They also worship a mother goddess, but it's a different one, Tianhou. It originally came from China. So what I was interested in about that is when it began as a mother goddess cult in China, but through many centuries, in a male-dominated system, it became more centralized. But when these Chinese migrants came to Vietnam, it again returned to its root as a folk cult. And my aunties who identify as king worship at the same pagodas that people who identify as Hoa or ethnic Vietnamese worship, but they maintain their that goddess means something slightly different to them, whereas to my aunties it's more of a Buddhist temple to them. So and that's where I saw Ông Tiêu, which is the guy with the long tongue to ward off evil spirits. So in these ways, I try to morph things together. It's a strategy for we're talking about how things influence each other. It's not always one thing completely suppresses and the other thing disappears. It's about adaptability as well. I mean, how do we accommodate many histories? That's totally what's driven this work. And folkloric practices, yeah, it's a very clumsy term. I began this project by wanting to look at folk art in Vietnam, and in a academic context, I was told there's no such thing as folk art. So it was more about trying to look at the objects or things within contexts. And then I began to see it as, I read this author of supernaturalism in southern Vietnam, and he talks about it, Do Mi Thien talks about it as a process of resisting domination and spiritual resistance. And I just I gravitated towards that idea because it's about the in-between spaces. So that's why I talked about morphing and grafting, like the zone originally being a nature fertility motif, and now national defender motif. So I'm interested in the layers. And that's why I build them from Warana, my worm, dragon, snakes, because that fluidity, like how do we move in between spaces and find the connections between each other, whoever your other is. And so, and also honoring the clay as a material in its own right. So I try morphing between those more figurative forms and the more abstract forms is a way of trying to let it speak to me more than, as well as me trying to process history through them and the different.
So maybe that's the ritualistic practice.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Although it's invisible, but like with many artworks, when you walk in a space, you don't know the entire process or thought system that's gone there, but it touches people in any way whatsoever from their own kind of background or experiences, then that is it. It becomes something else, and that's a wonderful thing. So it's very open to that. Does that sound okay?
Thank you. We can move to the next question now if you're happy for that. This comes from Reina Takuchi. Could you possibly extend on your use of playfulness in your work and how play may be used as a tool for reclamation and reconciliation?
Well, in the one sense of reconciliation, I suppose it's we're talking about the environment, the earth itself.
Well, no, let's focus on one of your work. Like we spoke a little bit about Vomit Girl. I think Vomit Girl is a great example. It's the main orange.
Well, they're all iterations of Vomit Girl.
They're all iterations. But let's start. Yeah, let's use, because the orange Vomit Girl that you've all seen as part of the hero image of this talk is a great example of the and we sort of try to touch on this rejection of culture, you know, this idea of, you know, ejecting something that you're refusing. But then I've also noticed in my practice that she started to introduce things like insertables. So you've got all those little bits and pieces. In one of the slides, we showed all these little armatures, I guess you would call them, or
insertable pieces.
Pieces, which it's like putting it all back together, or you can modify each of these works. To sort of take back in as well. So I think there's like a playfulness of like literal physical play, but also
it's like the story is not finished. It's going to be
it's parts and pieces
going and and learning new information and processing that way. Oh, well, reclamation. What does that mean to you?
I think that is the process of reclaiming, of taking what you know and what you have access to, and putting it back in.
Because one of the great experiences about going back to Vietnam was, oh, I've lost so much time. Oh, I don't know anything. Oh, where do I start? Oh, I don't want to be an oppressor. I don't want to sort of like, why do I like this thing? It's really bad because X, Y, Z. But you have to own your own history and go somewhere from there and try to connect it. It's all you can. If you delete yourself.
Yeah, but there's inherent difficulty in being displaced.
Anyway, so thank you, though. That's very thought-provoking, all of those questions so far. I really appreciate it.
Is there another one there, Amrit?
Yeah, we've got one more question here from William Yang. May, you have developed your work into its own complete intercultural cosmology, beyond its first expression, which was more of a gut reaction. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, I kind of feel like I was saying to Adam just after we prepared this the other day, and I said, Adam, I think I've created a folklore for Vomit Girl, and so I think that's quite spot on there with William's comment. And I remember when one of the first times I went to William when I had I didn't know what to say, and he spent hours and hours and hours trying to just help me string out a sentence. And now, at least with so then there was this Vomit Girl, and now I've been able to go back to the thing and try and unpack what that is. So yeah, thanks, William.
Thank you, Mai and Adam. If there are no more questions from our attendees, Adam, I'll throw back to you to wrap up. Thank you very much.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I think it was like an absolute pleasure, and thank you to Mai, of course, who's been so vulnerable and open to share this this new body of work, as well as your thoughts and your entire story to me and everyone here today. So I really appreciate that, and thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. Again, thank you to the Australia Council for the Arts, 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art, and of course the Factory, as well as Campbelltown Arts Centre for facilitating this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.